can start. What's exactly the difference between Talmud Bavli and Yirushalmi, and why is Bavli taught most, like in yeshiva, or in general?
I think the basic answer is history. The Talmud Yirushalmi was edited about 100 years after the formulation of the Mishnah. Talmud Bavli was edited 250 years after that. So the Talmud is largely a compilation of discussions of the Mishnah. And it means that the Bavli includes much, much more than Yirushalmi because it covers a much longer period of history, including the period of history of the Yirushalmi, but another 2.5 centuries. Not only that, but there was constant contact between the Babylonian scholars and the Israeli scholars. There were several people who made trips back and forth and brought the latest information from each side to the other side. And there's a Gemara in Menachos, which, when I came across it, gave me a tremendous insight into this question. The Gemara there is talking about a certain law of tzitzis, and they're discussing it and expressing various views, and a visitor to the group offers a view with an argument, and it's clearly superior to everyone else's contribution. Thank you very much. It's clearly superior to everyone else's contribution. And the people in the home group are a little bit embarrassed. And the Rosh Yeshiva says, "Why are you embarrassed? He's from Israel." Meaning, so of course he knows better. I mean, you shouldn't, we expect him to know better. Now, the he in that discussion from Israel was Ravina. Ravina is one of the two editors of the Talmud Bavli, which means that one of the editors of the Babylonian Talmud was himself an Israeli scholar, which means that the Talmud Bavli has in it a very strong injection of the learning of the land of Israel. So it's more comprehensive, and it's later material, and that's why it takes precedence. Now, in terms of its style, very often, the discussion of a particular subject accumulates over the centuries. So the discussions in Yirushalmi tend to be much shorter. And because they're much shorter, they're often much less complex. They consider a narrower range of alternative points of view. So, as compared to the Babylonian Talmud, discussions in the Jerusalem Talmud are fragmentary. So that's why the bottom line decisions are made on the basis of the Bavli. Everyone who was a great scholar of Judaism knew the Yirushalmi. There's no such thing as being a Talmudic scholar without knowing Yirushalmi. So it isn't as if it was ignored, but people who had limited time and limited ability focused on the Babylonian Talmud for the reason that I just mentioned. And having mentioned Yirushalmi and its status, I will share with you an incident that I witnessed myself. This incident and its upshot are full of prejudice. And I'm recording it because I'm proud of the prejudice. About 20 years ago, I was at the University of Toronto, and a student came to me and he said, "The Talmud has holes in it. It's not logically solid." I said, "Really? Why do you say that?" He said, "Because I'm studying the Talmud with my professor, and there are definitely holes in it." I said, "Really? What tractate are you studying?" He said, "Well, I'm studying the Jerusalem Talmud's tractate Kiddushin." Now, frankly, I didn't learn Yirushalmi to any great extent. I've learned a few Masechtos, so I didn't specialize in it. I said, "Do you happen to have it with you?" He said, "Yes." I said, well, let's take a look at it, and you show me where the holes are. I'm interested to see this. So we take it out. Now, the standard commentary on Yirushalmi is called the Pnei Moshe, who plays a role somewhat similar to Rashi's role on the Bavli. Not nearly in Rashi's class, but okay. Basic explanation of how the Pshat works. So I take the Mishnah, I read the Mishnah and explain it according to what the Pnei Moshe says. I go through the first page of Gemara, back and forth. I explain it according to the Pnei Moshe, and I say, I don't know, I don't see any problems here. I don't see any holes. You show me, where are the problems here? He says, well, the way you explained it, I don't see any holes either. I said, really? Oh, so then, who are you studying this with? My professor. Who's that? Well, she got her doctorate in Talmudic studies from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And her specialty is researching feminism in the Talmud. She can't explain a Gemara with a Pnei Moshe. I'm reading it first time. I'm not a great Talmudic scholar. I'm average at best. She's a professor with a doctorate from the Hebrew University. She can't explain Pshat with the Pnei Moshe? Yeah, disrespect the academic world in Jewish studies. Disrespect. There may be some exceptions, 1 in 100, but you'll be right 99 times out of 100. Yeah, okay. So that's really the basic idea in the Yirushalmi. You know, there's a tradition that when you go to the world to come, and there's a learning setup, any book or series that you studied at some point in your life, that particular author, that particular how shall I say, that particular set will be open to you. Something that you never took a look at, it will be closed. So I thought to myself, well, I don't want the Yirushalmi to be closed to me. I learned the Daf Yomi. I learned Daf Yomi for 45 years. So for a certain period of time, I learned the Yirushalmi side by side with the Bavli. A few Masechtas. They said, okay, so when I get to the world to come, the Yirushalmi will be open to me. I'll be able to interact with that as well. So I did learn a few Masechtas in the Bavli. By the way, the text of the Yirushalmi is in very poor shape. The Gaon of Vilna rewrote whole pages, especially in Zeroim. He rewrote whole pages of Talmud because the texts had become so corrupt and so unintelligible that he had to do that. The Bavli was kept much, much better than that. There are problems in the Bavli also, but not nearly to that extent because it wasn't studied as much. And by the way, I had one more story. This is really amazing. Someone in the late 19th century produced a phony volume of Yirushalmi. He claimed that it was a manuscript that he found, one that had never been published. You don't have neither Bavli nor Yirushalmi on all of the sets of Mishnah. There's some that are just skipped. This fellow claimed that he had found a Yirushalmi on a Mishnah, on a Mishnayos, which didn't exist before. Found a manuscript for, of course. The truth was he wrote it himself. Which means you got to be pretty good to do that. You know, he has to know the lingo, know the style. But he did it himself. It was a forgery. And he passed it around, and many scholars at least took it on probation. The Rogatchover, the great Rogatchover of Rome, was the one who discovered the forgery. And this is how he did it. He happened to know that in every tractate, there's at least one sage whose name is mentioned only in that tractate. He happened to know that. And the poor fellow who made the forgery didn't want to make up names of scholars that didn't exist. So he only took names from other tractates. So the Rogatchover went through and he saw there wasn't a single unique name in this new tractate. That's how he was exposed. Can you imagine knowledge like that? Can you imagine paying attention to details like that? It's beyond belief. Beyond belief. Anyway, so that's a little bit about the Yirushalmi. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could maybe give some insights onto what exactly a Tisch is. In some ways, it's like a very big Shabbos table, and in other ways, it's utterly unlike the Shabbos table. What is the theory and practice behind the Tisch? Okay,
theory and practice behind the Tisch. First of all, there is something which people know about but they don't understand, and has a very ancient source, that the Rebbe will take some small bite of food from a whole, not only a dish, but a whole tray, several trays, take one bite, and then the rest of it will be given out to the people at the gathering. It's called shiraim. The word shiraim literally means leftovers, right? You could try this after I tell you the answer. You could try this with people to ask them whether they know the source of this practice, right? The truth is, you all read about it within the last week. Oh, wait a second. No, it's this week. Sorry, no, it's last year. This week. It's in this week's Parsha. Am I getting mixed up? No, it's last week's Parsha. Yeah, it's in last week's Parsha. Right? What happens at the feast that Joseph has with his brothers in Egypt? It says that they were set up with three places to eat, right? There was the Egyptian servants ate at one table, and Joseph ate at his own table, and the Jews ate at their table, separate table, because the things that the Jews ate were totem animals for the Egyptians. So to them it was an abomination to eat those animals. Now, I think you get an insight here into the sociology of the time. Egypt was very cosmopolitan. They didn't say, "You're in our country, do it our way. Don't you dare eat our precious sacred animals." No, you eat the sacred animals, fuck a shot. That's your diet. We no complaints. We still want to sit at the same table. Of course, to us it's disgusting. But it's an abomination. Fine. So each one gets his own food, and then it says, Joseph took from the food on his table and gave portions to his brothers. Excuse me, they have their own waiter, they have their own buffet, No, that's not enough. Not enough they should have their own food. They should have some of Joseph's food. Shiraim goes back 3,500 years to Joseph in Egypt. Now, the basic idea is that the Hasidic group functions in many ways like a family. Indeed, this is an extension of or I should rather say a particularization, of a general idea that the Jewish people functions as a family. The idea of family is not just a sociological reality, it's a concept. So, for example, this is like a footnote on a footnote, but I want you to have the deep background for this. It's very important. There are certain laws about how Jews treat each other differently from the way Jews treat non-Jews. Rosh Hirsch says, for almost all of them, there's a single theme, a single explanation. You have a requirement to treat all people justly, correctly, with truth. But you don't treat your brother with mere justice. There's a commitment, there's a sharing, there's sacrifice. So when the Torah says you can lend money to a non-Jew and take interest, but you can't do that to a Jew, and that was misunderstood and criticized on the grounds that, well, the Jewish Torah thinks taking interest on loans is evil, and it allows you to do the evil to non-Jews, doesn't it? Just doesn't allow you to do the evil to other Jews. So you see how terribly prejudiced and unjust the Hebrew Torah is. That's totally wrong. There's absolutely nothing wrong with taking money on a loan. If you rent my car, you pay me rent. If you rent my house, you pay me rent. If you rent my books, you pay me rent. If you rent my money, you pay me rent. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Nothing unjust about it. But when you lend money to your brother, you don't charge him interest because he's your brother. So Hirsch says that the laws that dictate the way Jews relate to Jews, as opposed to the way Jews relate to non-Jews, are the laws of how you treat people who are members of your family, as opposed to people who are people, but not members of your family. I once read a paper in philosophy said that every major system of ethics makes no room at all for treating members of your family differently from other people. Now, here the road splits. People who are really committed to philosophy and really out of it say so much the worse for family. Normal, intelligent people say so much the worse for philosophy. I mean, these systems are missing an obvious moral reality, and if they're missing it, then they're missing it. There's something wrong with them. So now, in a certain sense, the Hasidic movement is also a family. There's one patriarchal figure. Yeah, I said that for the feminists. There's one patriarchal figure at the top, and they're all members of his family. The Rebbe will go to the wall for his Hasidim. You know, there's a Gemara that talks about a Chassid Shota, an insane Chassid. He's a person who sees a woman drowning and says, I don't look at women, let her drown. He's insane, right? You've got to be willing to jump into the water to save the person who's drowning. That's what Rebbe does. He jumps into the water to save his Hasidim who are drowning. He's just got to go down to their level, and he has to relate to them in a way they can understand and lift them up, like you do with your children. Just like you do with your children. So this is like in a certain sense, it's like a family gathering. And, you know, you have them once a week, usually, sometimes twice, Friday night and Shabbos afternoon, late Shabbos afternoon. And this is a time for the Rebbe to provide for his Hasidim. Now, in many different places, the actual procedure is very different. I was once in Tanya at the Tisch. The Tisch begins 4 hours after Lech Benchen. That means that for the first 3 hours of Shabbos, the Rebbe does not eat or drink anything, because he wouldn't do it before Kiddush. Then, this was in the summertime, it was like 11 o'clock at night. Hasidim come, the Rebbe makes Kiddush on wine. The Rebbe makes some motzi on bread and speaks for an hour. 40 minutes is a complicated Talmudic discourse, all from memory. No books. The last 20 minutes is an ethical discourse, all from memory. And I know the Hasidim understood him because if he hesitated to finish a sentence, they would finish the sentence for him. So they were definitely understanding him. And after an hour of speaking, then came the food of the dish and the sharing out and all the rest, and the singing, and sometimes there's dancing. There's a chance for the Rebbe to try to make an impression on the Hasidim for things that he thinks are important, things that are important to them now because of things that have happened, or things that are anticipated being happening, and to stress values that he feels that need to be stressed. So that's one aspect of it. It's the family with the leader of the family. They're interacting, at least in a public way, with the Hasidim. Second of all, it's sharing with other Hasidim. You're there together with those whom you live with, those with whom you do business, those with whom you have intermarried children. It does function like a clan. What else can I tell you about a Tisch? Even the singing together. You have 100 men, 200, some places 500 more, all singing together. There's a certain solidifying. It's unified. By the way, you should understand that this is all voluntary. This is all voluntary. People in the movement say Hasidim vote with their feet. You can't force a person to remain a Chassid of a Rebbe. And Hasidim change. They go from Hasidus to Hasidus. Some leave Hasidus altogether. Some become Hasidim. So it's all voluntary. When people feel a kind of inspiration, they feel an impetus to do better than they have been doing, to pick themselves up, to develop themselves. That's a little bit about the idea of a Tisch. Yeah.
What's the perspective of a Chassid in a Tisch that sees non-Chassidic members there at the Tisch? Is that seen as an intrusion in a way, or is it very welcoming?
Not at all. To put it in, what's the perspective of Chassidim on seeing non-Chassidim at the Tisch? If I would put it in the most chauvinist possible way, the attitude would be, we have the truth, and maybe you'll figure it out. Maybe you too will come to see the truth. So by all means, come in your droves. We're happy to have you. Now, of course, they're expected to be good guests. They're expected not to but they don't have to dress like the Chassidim. All the Chassidim that I know, if somebody came in jeans and a shirt and so on and so on, no one would say a word. We're open to share what we have. I have a pshat. Sometimes I do this. I'm not sure what I'm doing is right, but when I see a verse and I feel very strongly that the verse means something, not as opposed to other meanings, but in addition, and I look for it in the commentaries, I don't find it. Sometimes I say, well, if I didn't find it, maybe it's wrong. And sometimes I feel so strongly about it that I do share it. In Mizmor Dovid, the 23rd Psalm, it says, you arranged before me a table, neged sorarai, opposite my enemies. So the commentators say there, my enemies are coming to destroy me. They're coming to attack me. I'm so secure, I don't even bother to defend myself. I arrange a banquet. I'm enjoying myself at a banquet, and they're going to break their heads on the stones. They're not going to accomplish anything. I'm not saying we should be pacifist, and there are laws of war. I'm aware of that, and I know that you take. Okay. I hear all the politics coming out of the corner, out of the cobwebs. But I want to suggest, in addition, another pshat. My enemies are coming to me. Not only am I secure, I'm having a banquet, but there are empty places at the table. And I'm inviting you. Let's share together. I have more than enough. I have everything. Come and share with me. I think that's the way to disarm the so-called enemies. And people who aren't enemies at all, but are just exploring and who want to come, I think they're welcome everywhere. Yeah.
As someone who's searching for the truth, how do you recommend going about like the vast sea of like different quote unquote truths in Judaism, like the different Minhagim and all this? I personally don't have any family Minhagim. My dad's a guy. So it's kind of like overwhelming to, some people say I have to take on only one particular minhag and like follow one person, and then some other people say it's like a free-for-all, and I'm kind of lost over here.
I went through this myself personally, so the question is, how do you orient yourself in the vast variety of minhagim, customs of Judaism? How do you build for yourself a life of with this type of material included? Now, first of all, I just want to make a remark that comes from my background. The word truth doesn't apply here. If you want to apply truth anywhere, it would be in halacha, Jewish law. The customs, almost never do you have one group saying that the other group's customs are wrong. They just have different customs, that's all. So truth doesn't apply.
Right. That's why I put it like...
Yeah, but you have to be careful for yourself, not just in communication. If you use the word truth, it will tilt your mind in a certain direction, which I think you should resist. I started out with also no background, no custom. I thought to myself, boy, am I fortunate. Since I have no family customs, I'll just pick and choose the ones that I, that are meaningful to me, that are inspiring to me, and so on and so on. It took me a few years to figure out that that's not practical. And it's not practical because they aren't isolated. You're making a complex, each piece of which affects your general attitude towards things. And it takes genius to figure out a set of customs that will integrate and reinforce one another and create a spiritual, psychologically, and practically meaningful whole. So I realized in the end that the only practical thing to do is to choose one of the various styles of practicing Judaism, of which there are many today, and it would be worthwhile to try to experience some of them, to see how they operate things, and make a choice, but then to adopt their set of customs, lock, stock, and barrel. And there's not only, it's true for many reasons. One reason is that otherwise it won't be integrated, it won't be consistent. Second of all, you need to belong to a group. And if you don't think that you need to belong to a group, don't get married. Because your wife and your children will definitely need to belong to a group. And if you don't know that, then you're not ready to get married. So you're going to have to belong to a group, and therefore you need to find a group whose general style is the best fit for you that you can find. And of course this changes over time as you spend more time in a group and in a style. It could get worse, but it could often get better. You get more used to it, become more fluid in it, have more understanding of it, and it could become much easier to operate with. I'm a musician, a classical musician, and it's not enough to play the notes. The notes have to be played in such a way that they make sense, that they express something coherent. I can do this even with words. There's a famous line from Shakespeare. Now imagine that you heard it spoken like this: to be or not to be, that is the question. Yeah, it's very profound, but not said like that. It's got to have feeling. It has to have emphasis. It has to have pause. Different people will say it differently. Different actors could say it differently. But one thing they'll all have in common is one way of saying it will communicate a certain attitude in a consistent fashion. And if someone says it in such a way that the first three words communicate one attitude, and the last three words communicate a different attitude, and just leaves the listener totally perplexed and disoriented, he's messed it up. Same thing is true with a piece of music, where the crescendo is, where the climax is, where, and how it ends up afterwards is something which is, the way you play it has to express that. If you know musical style, you know that it's built in, and you have to respect that. So, the only practical thing to do is to look around and see how people do things and try to find initially the best fit that you can. And put up with the other things which aren't as good a fit. That'll be good for you, and be good for your... And by the way, this is based on a Gemara in Pesachim, because there it talks about changing your residence. And in those days, there were lots of cities with tiny Jewish communities. And there you had one Rav, and you had one set of laws, in legally diverse issues. There would be one set of laws, one set of customs. And when you changed residence, you were expected to adapt to the new laws and customs of the new residence. Not supposed to be a lone wolf, doing your own thing while everybody else is doing something different. No. So you want to join a community, and when you join that community, you want to be part of the community in that respect. That's the way I think it should be handled. Yeah.
If there are many different kinds of communities with many different kinds of, musical, their own kind of their outlook, their take on things, the way they express or their series of notes, their coherent picture, how would you characterize Ohr Somayach?
In terms of its music?
Well, no, not sorry. I was
Oh, yeah,
trying
you're using
to
it as
use
an-
the analogy that you.
Oh, well, the
Given
last-
the scheme of the entire Jewish picture, where's Ohr Somayach?
okay, so, but without having the map in front of us, I can't say, 20 degrees northeast. That's not going to help, but I can describe it. Ohr Somayach is one of a type of institution which is not very old at all, maybe 50 years old. It's an institution of the Baal Tshuva movement. I don't think any time in history that you had institutions like Ohr Somayach and other sister institutions that you have all over the world, where you have young men from, let's say, 18 and up, whose knowledge base is essentially zero, but some of whom have had advanced education, and they're bright and had a certain amount of worldly experience. So they have reasonable intellectual standards, and they think of themselves as intellectual people, and they have to learn the most elementary information in a sophisticated manner. This required an entirely new type of educational method. Talmud. You're teaching Talmud to people who can't read. That was never done before. Never. The people who don't know the ABCs don't have the basic information. A page of Talmud has in it a gigantic amount of information that's taken for granted. And here you're teaching people for whom every line is new. Every line is a brand new idea. They haven't heard of these things before. So the whole educational technique had to be changed. The balance of subjects had to be changed. The type of analogies and cultural references that are used in teaching had to be changed. The day in the yeshivas that we had the last couple of 100 years, and then going back, no one ever heard of a 7-hour day. 7 hours? That's for 6-year-olds. Come on, grow up. And yet, the beginning section here, we have a 7-hour rule. You spend 7 hours in education in the yeshiva, and the rest of the day is yours. Officially, you don't have to be here. We'll pay your food, room, and board, and instruction for 7 hours. So all sorts of things had to be done. Counseling services have to be available. Certain minimal personal standards have to be insisted upon, even though, as you know very well, we don't have preconditions as to your belief system, your value system, but your behavior has to be respectful. You want to leave on Friday afternoon and come back Sunday morning and spend Shabbos at the beach or, riding motorcycles in the hills. No one is going to say a word. Don't turn the light on and off in the dormitory. Here. Don't do it here. We have our standards for how you should behave here. So this kind of institution is like 50 years old. Before that, it didn't exist. There wasn't a population that needed it. This has spawned a whole literature. Art Scroll became an empire. This is worth knowing. How did Art Scroll start? The great empire of Art Scroll. Meir Zlotowitz was a student at yeshiva. One of his fellow students died. And he decided he wanted to do something for his shloshim and the first 30 days of the mourning period. So he put together Megillas Esther in the Art Scroll style in English. It was a brand new creation. Nothing like that existed. He did it as a sign of appreciation for a fellow student who died. That was the cornerstone. To my mind, that's how the empire was built. It was built on that purity of intent, that caring and for the lost neshama, for the family, something should memorialize him, and it became an empire. thousands of volumes. And then the shock that not some of them are translated into Hebrew and they're in Israeli yeshivas. That was the farthest thing from their minds. They were doing it for the poor English reader who couldn't read anything. The Talmud, the Schottenstein Talmud is in every yeshiva in the world. The most right-wing yeshiva, it's been a hit all over the world. So this type of literature and this type of education is really a brand new situation. And then a yeshiva that offers a 2-week course or a 4-week course, or lectures are open, you can come in for an hour and leave. There never was such a thing. It didn't exist. Yeshivas were for people who were really committed, and heart and soul. So that's its position generally. Now, among the Baal Teshuva yeshivas, it is commonly known, sometimes with affection and sometimes with loathing, as the Harvard of the yeshivas. We do have I'm saying this even though I'm a member of the staff, but we do have a very finely educated staff. So we appeal to people who are on the high end of the intellectual spectrum, the educational spectrum. My goal, and the goal of some of the other people here, is to reproduce a university setting. I teach the way I would teach in the university, the way I did teach in the university, and I try to make people who come from the university feel comfortable in the educational setting. That also was not done. The yeshiva system was quite different from that. So we're doing something that's really very, very recent in Jewish history. Yeah, yeah.
In the third commandment, what does lo yenake mean? Like, one who takes Hashem's name in vain, that he won't absolve him or won't, forgive him or clean him? I don't know what it means. Like, why on that specific commandment, not others?
I don't know in detail. I have not studied that. But the bottom line, with one exception, the bottom line is that tshuva works for everything. That's a general rule. Tshuva works for everything. What that means is this: no matter what a person does, no matter how severe it is, if he does tshuva, he leaves the world clean. Now, I'm putting it very carefully, partly because I want to be right, but also because I want you to understand that it doesn't imply that tshuva by itself takes care of the problem. It just means that it guarantees he leaves the world clean. But there might be other things that have to happen to him in addition. It's just that tshuva guarantees they'll happen. So the Rambam in the first chapter of Hilchos Tshuva, basing himself on the Gemara and Yuma, says that there are 4 categories of transgression. For the simplest and least severe, just doing tshuva does everything. Does tshuva, he's finished with it. The next grade up requires tshuva and Yom Kippur. The grade beyond that requires tshuva, Yom Kippur, and suffering. And the final, which is the worst grade, requires tshuva, Yom Kippur, suffering, and death. And if you will say, what do you mean, Rabbi, death? Everybody dies. You're right. It's a good question. And the answer is you die early. But does tshuva, he's guaranteed that he'll leave the world clean. Which then means, as I'm sure you're thinking in your minds already, well, let's say, suppose he performed the transgression in February and he dies in March. Then he doesn't have Yom Kippur. And he might not have time for suffering. That's true, he might not. But early death includes everything. Early death is the capstone which, if you don't have the other items separately, covers that as well. So, when I say that tshuva works, it means not that tshuva by itself wipes away the transgression, but if a person does tshuva, he leaves the world clean. So lo yenake can't mean he remains stained. He remains broken. He remains degraded. That it cannot mean. Now, there is a mabit which is similar in spirit. And again, I haven't studied this one in detail, but there's a Gemara that says that there are 4 types of people who they don't receive the presence of the Shekhinah, of God's presence. And there's 4 categories of people who sin with their mouths. Now let's see if I can remember all of them. One is flatterers, and one is jesters, and one is people who speak Lashon Hara. Flatterers, jesters, I think liars. Now, the Mabit asks, what are we talking about? The person did tshuva or didn't do tshuva? If you tell me he didn't do tshuva, what then are Chazal saying? What are they telling me I didn't know? He's guilty of one of these, and by the way, it's talking about habitual violators, not one-time violators of these 4 types. If you're telling me he's a habitual violator, he didn't do tshuva, and he won't receive God's presence, thanks for the news. Right? If a person does something wrong, doesn't do tshuva, you could say that about almost anything. No, it must be that he did do tshuva. Well, if he did do tshuva, then why isn't he receiving God's presence? And now, what the Mabit says is this, that there's a certain level of closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world to come that they won't have. They won't be guilty, they will go to the world to come, they won't suffer punishment or pain, but it's a certain level of closeness that they won't have. Now, I don't know, Mabit's the only one who I know who says this, but that could be the idea of lo yenake, that a person's not cleansed entirely. He isn't perfectly rehabilitated. That's at least a candidate. But the idea that tshuva makes a person not guilty anymore, and the tshuva enables him to get into the world to come, and that there's no suffering after death. No suffering after death, no Gehenna after death. Tshuva does that, that's going to apply to everything.
What did you say, can you go into detail about the transgressions of flattery and jest?
Okay, for us, speech is absolutely central. It's very interesting. Aristotle defined the human being as a rational animal. The Torah rejects that definition. I mean, it precedes that definition by 1,000 years. But it rejects that definition. When the Torah describes man becoming a living spirit, the Targum Onkelos translates a speaking spirit. Ruach Mamalalah. What's the difference between reason and speech? Reason is something that you can exercise in the privacy of your own mind. You can examine your ideas, decide what to believe, and you can do it reasonably or unreasonably. Speech takes what you have in your mind and brings it into the physical world. Speech, says the Maharal, is the process of investing the physical with the spiritual. Bringing that which is rooted in the spiritual, which is your mind, and your will and your feelings and everything else that's about your soul. But here it's the mind. I mean, speech could express your feelings also. And bringing it into the physical world. So what the Torah is telling us is that what's special about a human being is that a human being can create a marriage of the spiritual and the physical. That's not the same as just thinking it through and getting it right. So, violating speech is a terrible, terrible type of crime. You're taking what, in a certain sense, is the highest faculty of the human being, and you're poisoning it. Now, again, we're talking about these 4 categories of people who do it habitually. You know, people do things, first of all, people do some things only occasionally. They know they're wrong, and usually they exercise self-control. And sometimes they don't exercise self-control, so occasionally they make mistakes. There are other things where people do them regularly, but that's because they look at themselves as regularly out of control. I've met people like that with anger. They're just angry people. And psychologists will say it's always the way because your parents treated you and so forth and so on. Either they're right or they're wrong. But they're angry, but they know it's wrong. And they regret it. And they hate themselves for it. And they're still, so to speak, out of control. Then there are people who do things with no self-consciousness at all. I once met a guy who was very relaxed, very self-confident, very content. So I asked him whether he's perfect. He said no. So I said, what are you doing to improve yourself? He said, Rabbi, I eat well, I sleep well, I accept myself as I am, with my imperfections. So I remembered something my Rebbe had taught me, and I thought, oh boy, is he lost. He's really lost, right? He's not even willing to face up to the fact that in certain areas he's a failure and really should change. No, there's no. Someone who's that relaxed about the corruption of his mouth is very, very far from basic Jewish consciousness. He doesn't know how precious the mouth is, how precious speech is, how central speech is to his identity. He doesn't know. If he knew, and he saw that he was failing, and failing habitually, he should feel terrible about it. What do you mean he doesn't feel terrible about it? It's because he's so dissociated from any Jewish consciousness. I think this is a symptom of why what he's doing is so damaging and so destructive. I don't know if that helps, but that's the end of the story. But
I also wanted to know what you meant specifically by jest and flattery.
You see, jesting, the Gemara is very much against jesting because what the jest does is to make it impossible to take things seriously. It deflates its seriousness. Let's see if I can give you an example. Imagine someone who's talking about eating and how it can be an animalistic act, and one should train oneself to eat like a human being rather than an animal, to appreciate that you are enabling the life of the soul in the body, not just the body, and talks about blessings and so forth and so on, and how one should eat carefully and so forth and so on. And somebody says, I wonder if he eats more than one meal in 4 days. Because if he has such high standards for eating, then he must be starving himself all the time. That's it. The whole hour is gone. Worthless. You're looking at him, you're saying he's probably starving because he can't eat, because he can't live up to it, it's all unrealistic. One line can kill the whole thing. So the Gemara says jesting should be reserved for Avodah Zarah, for idol worship. That you can jest about. That's right, you shouldn't take that seriously. You should think of that as something that's not worth, and that has no value. So jesting is a way of undermining the value of something, and almost everything has some value. So if you make jest, then
You can do the same thing for flattery, just so I can get a.
Flattery is even worse because I take that back. I shouldn't have said it.
I can see like sometimes when, I mean, maybe the definition of flattery is off in my mind, but I can see sometimes when it might be useful.
Yes. No, I don't. Flattery usually means praising a person for some qualities he doesn't have. That's not useful. It's destroying his self-knowledge, destroying his self-understanding. That's very bad. That undermines a person altogether. He can't deal with himself in a realistic way when you're flattering. By the way, now I'm coming to this question. You ever hear of the court jester in medieval times? Do you know what his job was? Not to make jokes so people would be happy. No, his job was to express criticisms of the king. Because you couldn't criticize the king, that was treason. But if it was all in jest and it wasn't meant seriously, then you could express criticisms of the king. His job was to bring criticisms of the king from the street to the attention of the king in a way that didn't compromise his absolute authority. When I read about that, I thought, that's pretty clever. That's pretty clever. Not just frivolous. It's a cultural way to preserve a certain value and yet give access to information that the king needs. Yeah.
Yeah, I find myself often distracted during praying, and the mind is very all over the place. Do you have any recommendations or maybe how you might have approached that back when?
Okay, so I have two recommendations, but it's a very good question. I think you should ask other people as well, because this is a matter of, I would say, spiritual strategy, and different people can have different strategies, and you can use all of them. One is to make the prayers personal. Put yourself into the prayers. Now, they're all in plural, they're all in general terms, but you are encouraged to apply them to your own circumstances. And when you talk about applying to your own circumstances, this sometimes requires just a little bit of sophistication. For example, people say to me, praying for health? Rabbi, I'm fine. I'm really healthy. So what should I have in mind when I'm praying for health? So aside from other people, that description is not correct. It's not that you are healthy. It is that you have been healthy up to this moment. But as you know very well, that can change like that. So the fact that you have been healthy doesn't mean you shouldn't pray to be healthy for the rest of the day, because that isn't in your pocket. You don't control that. And then there are other people who you care about, whose health, you should be concerned about. So if you put these prayers into the context of your own life, then I think that's one way to keep it alive. Things that are already meaningful to you. I guess the second thing I want to say is really an application of the first as well. Baal Shem Tov was asked this question by a lumber merchant. He said, when I'm praying, I'm thinking about the lumber in the warehouse and the price, and when the spring comes and the ice in the river thaws, and we float the lumber down the river to sell it to cities downstream, and how to do it, and how many people to hire, and I'm thinking about the lumber all the time. Rebbe, please tell me how I can stop thinking about the lumber. Baal Shem Tov said to him, think about the lumber. Don't stop thinking about the lumber. But when you start thinking about the lumber, ask yourself, where does the lumber come from? It comes from the forest. And where does the forest come from? It comes from the Creator. So don't say there are foreign subjects that I have to protect myself from. Say rather that I have a spiritual challenge to find the source of each of these items, each of these subjects, and trace it back to the source. That way you don't push it out of your mind. You look at the bottom rung on a ladder, and your job is to construct the higher rungs to climb back up. Those are two strategies that you can use to try to keep it in mind. But I think you should ask other people as well, because this is really a question of psychological strategies. And it's a very good question. And everybody's approach to this is partial, and you go up and down in your life circumstances, what pressures are on you. A person, for example, is suffering a health challenge. The blessing for good health, he'll be plugged in. But the blessing for the coming of the Messiah, maybe not. Because that's not what's on his mind right now. It's not what's occupying him right now. So that's natural. That's normal. But you should try to expand it. There is another thing you can do, and that's to study the prayers. Study the commentaries on the prayers. There are a lot of books in English on the prayers, even word by word on this monastery. There's a gigantic amount of interesting material there. I have a whole series of lectures on it. It's on my website. later compilations of my recordings, where I go through it word by word. So if you learn something new, that might catch your interest for a while and might integrate it into the prayers that you're saying. Those are all things that you can do.
In the process of growth, there's inherently ups and downs and whatever you call it, but I at least for me, I don't find it any easier knowing that there's ups and downs, and I'm still generally trending upwards, and when I'm in the process of one of those down periods. You have any advice on how to kind of reframe that, or?
No, I wouldn't say refrain it. But I'll tell you, I have an analysis of the downs. I don't think this applies to every person in every case, but where it applies, I think it's very useful to know. Let me give you a very oversimplified picture. Let's divide the person up into 3 areas: intellect, emotion, and behavior. Now, people are confronted with a challenge, or confronted with a circumstance that needs adjustment. Different people can change these different categories in different ways. And some people are much more flexible in some ways and less flexible in other ways. Some people changing their ideas like changing a coat. Changing their emotions is impossible, and their behavior is somewhere in between. And other people it varies. So what happens sometimes is this: you have a new idea or a new principle or a new behavior, and you're initially inspired by it, enthused by it. The part of you that changes most easily and most quickly with respect to this particular behavior or idea latches on and grows with it and adapts to it. And you may not even be conscious of the fact that you're leaving other parts of you behind. And then at a certain point, the other parts wake up and say, hey, but if you're really doing that, it doesn't feel right. Or if you're really doing that, you have to bring your behavior along. Then you feel out of sync with yourself. You don't feel connected. You don't feel collected. You don't feel integrated. That's when a down comes. And then I think the way to look at the down is it's necessary, because you do have to bring all of you along. You can't just turn off part of yourself and say, oh, well, I'll only make progress on 1 or 2 of the 3 areas. It's not healthy. It's not even possible. So the down is a period of time in which you make sure that each of the parts of your personality are equally integrated into the pattern of life you're up to at this point in time, so that your platform is solid again, and then you can think about taking steps forward. That happens. I've seen that happen. I've even seen people who took the ball and ran with it in 1 or 2 of the areas and were running for 6 months. And after 6 months, when they realized the rest of them had been left behind, they had a crisis, terrible crisis. What am I doing here? Why am I doing this? Because they totally ignored that side of their lives. So the downs that come are really a blessing in disguise. That they encourage you to get back integrated and make sure everything's on track with minor irritation. I mean, if you want, you can think for an athlete that's sleeping every night, it's a down. He's not exercising, he's not practicing, right? He's not running. But you can't train tomorrow unless you sleep sometimes. The same thing is true here. You can't be going up all the time. Can't have it. Okay.